It's my first time reading in Ottawa for such a long time. This is such a nice room. Thank you for having me. It feels cozy, like you should know each other, but you don't all know each other, do you?
Very much.
That's good, so then I'm not the only stranger. So this book just came out in the fall, The More, and it does very much come out of my work walking around in the world with poems, especially at Mount Sinai Hospital. But other wares elsewhere, and so the book has threads of mortality, meditation, hospitals, and other fun stuff. But what I'd like to do, because I was told I could read up to 30 minutes, which seems like an awfully long time, was to read for a while and then maybe pause and see if you want to ask anything, and then read a little bit more. And I'll check in with you. You can see what you feel like doing. But what I had planned to read suddenly shifted when I got to Ottawa, because so I went to this bed and breakfast up the road, and when I walked in this afternoon at 3 o'clock, and I was really tired, I didn't sleep very well. It's like all these little kids there. I'm like, what's going on? And it turns out it was a daycare as well. Right? I'm like, holy cow, what have I done? So I had this little exchange on Facebook with some people who were very empathic, and like I laughed a bit about it. And so eventually I warmed up to it, and the woman was really nice, and the kids were cute, you know. So I started to soften up, and then I thought, you know, everything in my life that I have disdained, I have ended up doing. This is, I don't know if anyone else has this experience, but like, it's usually like a flag for me of something I'm going to do next. So instead of starting with the heaviest, I'm going to read this poem called Opposites. Everything I dread, I look forward to. Whoever I condemn, I am him. Whatever I think is irrelevant is, until I become irrelevant. Tomorrow I'll be the one I bully today. The next person I love scares me already. You have a sweet face, a boy told me when I was young, so I didn't show it. I use my mind to hurt when I am hurting. The queen sees her cruelty and bends in grief. Like her, my remorse is as awful as my arrogance. The word care means to worry. To suffer is to allow. The pain then is part of the happiness now. Avoidance meets us halfway. We could cut to the chase and embrace. Yea, I'm alive weak. Because she almost died, fading from the world, her body becoming a thing carried to the hospital. Because she became delirious, lost time and season. Because someone acted, doctors, nurses, friends. Because she had people, some who didn't know her. Because she almost lost them. Almost lost herself and the sun, and the spring equinox which comes tomorrow, which brings back planets into renewed, and orbit into renewed alignment, brings again cherry blossoms after devastated trees, regeneration of skin on lips after winter. Because she is older now, and was not halted. Raw. I'm trying to see who is in front of me without exclusions or excuses. The membrane remembering, the porous us. I carry the hospital in my backpack, itinerant with a pen. At meetings, I'm supposed to say things that will relieve so people can go on. Soon, I will be fired. Ethel. I'm remembering that old game. What 3 people, living or dead, would you invite for dinner? I never answered. I had no heroes or did not imagine they would come. Today, Hafiz, for sure. But the others keep changing. Leonard Cohen, Adrian Rich, Allen Ginsberg, and Ethel Merman. I was looking for a politician or someone really sexy to round it out. The closest I could get was Colette. I thought, look at all those Jews in that list. A coincidence? Thought of Beethoven and my old friend Sally Harmon, maybe. Yes, I'd love to have Sally for dinner. I miss her. She taught me to make jam and gin. So that's it then. Hafiz, Leonard Cohen, and Sally. If Sally can't come, Ethel. She'd blow the lid off the place. Appointment in Samara. 30 people in chemo today, multiplied by X hospitals in Y countries and Z universes. Back here, H smiles through 4 syringes of chemicals, 2 bags of saline, and a flush of life-giving killer liquid. White-haired sisters in their 70s share clippings of their modeling days with shirtless men in big cars. Take selfies holding up their matching drips. A woman in the corner looks exactly like what is happening to her. Pale and bald, like coal after a fire. Slap me good and hard with mortality while I'm strong. My body wants to run as though it's seen a ghost. Hospital Pastoral. O fathoming heart, subtler than the metrics ordained by the new wing, smaller than a bread box, thicker than a lout, call the grief, call the grace. Send out your practical arts. Sing. Sad beyond protocol. I'm tempted to tell you some stories about these poems, but you can ask me for a little. We pause a minute, but I will tell you something about the next one. Many of the poems spontaneously came up in response to certain situations or moments, or I'm reading them now in response to certain things. But this one that I'm going to read, I do all kinds of things at the hospital. I do workshops, and I write people poems on the spot, and I offer prescriptions of poems. So one day I was given like 50 feedback sheets of patient feedback upon leaving the hospital. And I was asked if I would write a poem. Right, so I took them to my favorite restaurant, low-key place, and I started reading them, and I thought, well, I'm either going to throw up or burst into tears because they were so intense. So I wrote this poem, and it was a very long, well, not that long, a couple of pages of a narrative poem. It was intense, but to be honest, it wasn't as hard to write as the poem I had to write for the staff experiences, because the patients at least had some modicum of some gratitude among them, even though there was a lot of stress, but the staff were really in a rough shape. So that was even harder, but leave that for another time, or you can read it in the book. But so this poem that I wrote was a couple of pages, and it was a narrative poem, and then when I was editing the book, with the most extraordinary human and poet around. And if you don't know his work, I recommend you read Phil Hall. It's such a great gift to be able to work with him. He edited it down to 4 lines, which was absolutely right on. So I will read it to you. Discharge summary. My first meeting with the doctor came after I had died. Until then, the care was excellent. The sweet potato was delicious. I never understood a word the young nurse said. Just a place to pause here. Rest. In my bed, I'm restless. I want a fellow moon to look at the moon with. What is the old lady across doing up so late? Hello, other moon. I say something about the way the book is structured, and it's not anything anybody knows consciously, except that I'm telling it to you because it's sort of implicit, it's just sort of subtly in there. There's 3 sections, and when Phil and I were working on this, what we kind of learned in the evolution of it was they're like wings. The 2 sections on the end are like wings of a hospital. One that takes you in, and one that takes you out. The first and the third. And then this middle one is this like heavy building in the middle. It's got all the prose pieces. It's where all the weight is. So I've just been reading to you from the first section, and I'm going to read some poems from the third. And if we have some time, I'll read a chunky from the middle. Would you like Halls? I don't usually describe it. But since I'm up here, I actually have some if you want. Back pain. Then the light on the television went out. I turned over on the heating pad, trying for a comfortable position on the floor. I got to the section of the 400-page book called Epilogue and did not want to go on. I went for my notebook, but the pen was just too far on the mysterious field of the carpet. Maybe the radio. Instead, I lay quietly, listening to the subway, feeling it under me, like an animal rubbing itself along my personal earth and beginning to enjoy it. The rain chicken. My mother invites me for dinner. I'll make a chicken. I ask for a rain chicken. Sunday? Sunday comes. I'm thinking, I love her. On Facebook, she is the artist Anne Bald Bloom. In her apartment over there, she's whipping the paints with her sticks and fingers into a frenzy of orange and green explosions until she's tired and sits down. She is 80 years old, and last week I saw how her eyes had a ring of green around the brown. I've not gotten out of bed. I'm writing this poem instead of a visit. If you're reading this, we may not even be alive anymore, but we were. What she did on the mountain. She stood up in her fear, and the fear left. What was required was seeing, plus love, plus action, and stepping over stones. The panic in the young ones' faces, voices, led to a sharper seeing of where it was less steep and gravity didn't call them so fast. And she brought the people over the pass like a goat. Their legs shook as they moved until they were opened out into the clearing some call safety. that allowed a return to breath, an exhalation, an arrival at the pause of getting through together, a not untenable turbulence, an unblazed path. I'm going to pause at this place where we've gotten through together. I'm just going to see what time it is. You can breathe. So I've been reading for about 15 minutes, and I'm just wanting to sort of take a breath myself and see where you are, and if there's anything you want to ask me, or...
I'll ask something.
Yeah.
How did you get the permission to use the Mark Rothko painting on the front cover, and why did you decide to use that?
Okay, so I will start with the second question first. Normally, I never choose the covers. My extraordinary publisher, Peddler Press, Beth Follett, has always found the covers that fit, and I've said, yes, go. But this book felt different than my other books because it seemed to have, it has a force and they all have different themes, but this one I really had this sense was about the work that I've been doing and about health and about living and dying, and it was very clear what the thing was becoming. And so for the first time I actually thought the color yellow, like I was blown away, like, what? Yellow? What is that? And I've loved Mark Rothko's work for a long, long, long time. And the actual image came to me of this image. And it was because actually the yellow is this sort of very, for me, my association with the image, very, very sort of warm, soothing, but it's got this kind of wound underneath, this kind of red. And the edges, it's got an edgelessness, which is really what I'm interested in also in terms of how nothing really has an edge. I mean, we leak into each other. I'm here improvising with you, you know, everything morphs, and the work I do here, you know, the edgelessness just feels like it matters a lot in terms of living. And so that was my desire. And then, of course, I thought, well, Mark Rothko will never get Mark Rothko. I might as well just forget that, which is sort of my historic way of approaching the world. And then all of a sudden I went, wait a minute, like, why don't you ask? So I asked Beth, who is like a dog with a bone when she wants something. And once I said, would you ask, she then went to town. And there is actually a really lovely blog that we wrote together about the whole process, which I should put on my website. But I'll give you the condensed version, which is she found out that the estate was administered by Mark Rothko's son, Christopher Rothko, and that she actually found his home address, snail mail, real letter. She wrote him a letter and said who she was and what she wanted, and had an exchange with him, and he asked to see a couple of the poems, and he said yes. And I had an exchange with him too about an old poem I'd written about Rothko, because I've written he's been such a sort of guide for me. That was one of the biggest gifts. Anything else? Anything you want to know? Yeah.
Where do you find time to write poems?
To do what?
Between your work, which I'm sure takes a lot of your...
Which work?
Both works.
Well, I think that maybe there's a bit of a thing I have to clear up here. Let me clear up. I'm very, very little a psychotherapist. Is that what you meant?
Yes.
Okay, like I'm like this big a therapist these days. I did practice more for about 20 years, and I also worked at the University of Toronto Counseling and Learning Skills Service as a therapist. But then the poetry just really wanted more room, and I wanted more room for it. And so, as I think Jean was sort of saying or alluding to, it was a way of creating a way to bring both together. So all my work really, with the exception of a tiny bit of practice, is around doing poetry in the world in ways that the world will have me. It doesn't have to be healthcare, but because of my experience, that's one of the places, also the university. And so I don't work a lot. I could work more if anybody wants me. I really don't. I'm pretty lazy. I play a lot with you. Like you can see, I'm very, I have fun, but then I'm really introverted, which is why those kids made me freak out. So I actually I make sure I have lots of time to lie down on the floor and look for poems. So maybe I want to read you. Okay to read a few more? Yeah. From the middle, so the middle section is where the heavyweights are. There is a big honkin' prose poem called "Walking the Hospital," which really kind of is the core of the book. It sort of is a bit sort of like a cinematic thing where you're like with me walking through, and I could read that or something else. You know what? Now that I've said that, I'm going to read that.
Yeah.
Because it's a big one, and maybe that's where I'll end. But then I won't read the title poem. Oh, it's such a choice. Okay, I'll read it to you since I'm here. Okay. Walking the hospital. When I was 17, I got a case of hives that didn't go away. I went to the Montreal General. They did tests and asked questions, but no one asked if anything had happened. A change of detergent, maybe? No, a suicide. I didn't think that was relevant, and no one else did. 3 months later, sitting with a friend drinking wine, she told me her friend was killed in a crash, and now we were talking. A week later, the hives were gone. What I remember from my hospital visit was walking with the doctor. He walked fast in his long white coat, and as I tried to keep up, he became aware of his gait, but didn't slow down. Walking the hospital, he called it. I see it now as a gate of ownership, the way the lawyers and police officers and criminals walked the halls of city court that time I was a witness, like they owned the place. It's a performance of invulnerability that strikes me when I see it as awesome and alarming and impossible. Now when I bring poetry into the hospital, I say to myself, wake up. You're going into a hospital. There are sick people here. I say, pay attention. This is not the way I've walked into any other job. Though I've been a psychotherapist at a university and an addictions counselor in a home the residents called the last house on the block, I didn't give over to the severity of their needs. I was so anxious to do it right, whatever it was, but now there is no right. Poetry in the hospital has no template, no colleagues, no management. I'm always temporary, and I go alone. When I look at the patients and staff, visitors, families, the fragility, I see how I don't own anything. Not my role, not my health, not my life. The first week I started, things got blurry fast. I was photographed for the newspaper in a big hoo-ha of celebration and curiosity about a poet in residence. I got dressed in very unpoetic clothes. Corporate, really. The publicity thrilled me with an identity. What does a hospital poet look like? I stood smiling in the hallway between emergency and the synagogue. That night I was back in emergency in my sweatpants with my mother's kidney failure. Am I the same person? I stood around like every other nervous daughter, grateful, terrified. I wanted to give poems to the staff instead of donuts. It was then that I made the vow to pay attention every time I came in, to wake up and say, sick people here, meaning also vulnerable people. The sand is shifting, and the person in front of me might walk the halls one day differently than the next. I would never know who I was dealing with or who I would be in response. Poetry was my currency when I had any currency at all. Otherwise, it was the heart. It got blurrier still. Friends got ill. I wore hazmat suits. Some got better. Some died. There were staff who wanted poems for their patients, and patients who wanted poems for their doctors. I prescribed poems on little pads. Some folks ignored me or politely recoiled. Emotion and poetry, two of the stickiest places you can lay your hand. I met people once and then never again. I met the starving who didn't know they were starving. Return customers in imaging, those waiting for results, for tests, for Wheel-Trans, for answers for a baby. Addictions, grief. The repetitive patterns that embarrass us and ground us and return us to each other. Trauma, fear, irritation, compassion, racism. Flu shots, gunshots, chemo, ortho, maxillofacial. Coffee shop, gift shop, bookshop. Construction, reconstruction, maternity, residency, redundancy, labor of all kinds. Kindness, bed, toilet, tanks, chair, wheels. Do not take for granted who will need or not need anything. My motto, everyone who is alive could use a poem. Whether they want one is a different matter. Once in the middle of a day spent in waiting rooms, a friend texted that her friend had just received a diagnosis in the same hospital, and now we were talking. Does she want a prescription? Does she want a poem? I asked, hesitantly thinking it ridiculous given the enormity. Yes, she said she did. I sat on the floor beside her. I'm not a pastoral care person, not religious really, but poetry forced me into something like one. I'd started writing poems on the spot for people, $1 a poem at their request. The conversation would drop from the realm of the social into a void out of which words sometimes came. In those moments, it was difficult to answer simple questions like my name. Wired into the crack the air made between us, I was plugged into something that didn't sleep. That's when I knew I needed whatever it is that poetry points to, the thing with feathers. The thing that steadies in the torrent, that allows the continued opening without falling in, or falling without landing. I call it meditation, but there are many forms. What do you plug into when you're suddenly plugged in and the things you think are normal have no bearing? My mother got well. My friend Judy got sick, then sicker, then well. My back went out. Staff went on leave or died. The doctor who took care of the city during SARS was no more. The biggest, wildest mayor in Toronto's history lay upstairs under anesthetic. These men, too, who owned the place, they were walking the halls differently, or not walking them at all. We all walk them differently depending on the day. I wrote poems for administrators, the CEO, prescribed them for residents from Egypt. People married, held rites of passage. But the blur, what were we beside action and exchange? Early on I thought, the hospital is my patient, but that's too grand. There are people having experiences here. Who you were when you came in is not the same, whether either. You bring home a new person in a tiny carrier or leave ones behind. Then my colleague in meditation with a big strong chest died from the lungs. I watched. I wrote a poem. I was not a relative, a friend, not a poet in residence, not a healthcare worker. What was I? He went down fast, his logic disappearing, his cheeks sinking into their bones. He was heading into a force that had no words but was palpable, quiet, and fierce. Like when people fall in love, the chemistry is not numerical. It was an intimacy. To be admitted to the precious moments of departure, to become aware that there is no admission, only a tear in the fantasy of separation, and a resting in what remains. We held him up until he flew. No thing holds it all together but awareness. Who is walking these halls now? Who is writing these poems? Who is reading them? And who cares? If each one person, poem, experience, identity, thought, bone, body, like a point of light, is just itself, does it need a story to connect it to the next one? Awareness, carry me.